What if the moment you try to brush off becomes the moment that changes your life forever? A millionaire sits alone in one of Atlanta's most luxurious restaurants, celebrating his latest victory. Outside, a little black girl watches him, her eyes hollow, her body small, her courage immense. She doesn't beg, she simply asks for his leftovers. He expects her to eat, but she doesn't. She wraps the food in plastic and runs. And something in him, something buried beneath fortune, status, and silence, won't let him look away. What he finds when he follows her down that alley will shatter everything he thought he knew about success, love, and the woman who once saved him. Stay with us, because this isn't just a story about food. It's a story about second chances, unseen heroes, and the quiet power of showing up when it matters most. Under the soft golden glow of chandeliers and the murmuring of smooth jazz from a grand piano tucked into a corner, the sovereign table buzzed quietly with the restrained elegance of wealth. Waiters moved like dancers across polished marble floors, balancing wine bottles and gold-rimmed plates, while conversations of mergers, private jets, and offshore properties floated from table to table like invisible smoke. Among the guests sat Elias Monroe, a 56-year-old real estate magnate whose name graced the headlines of Forbes and Business Insider, his sharply pressed navy suit hugging his shoulders like armor, his tie a thin line of maroon silk framing a crisp white shirt. He wasn't here for company. His assistant had offered to bring someone, but he'd declined. This was a night for silence, a personal celebration of closing the $300 million Uptown Tower project that would reshape the skyline of Atlanta and solidify his legacy. He swirled the wine in his glass absent-mindedly, a rare 1976 Bordeaux, older than the waiter who had poured it. His phone lit up beside his plate with congratulatory messages, but his eyes drifted away from the screen. Something about the taste of victory tonight felt metallic, hollow. He stared out past the window's reflection into the city night, lights flickering like broken stars against the glass. Then, like a quiet breath against the back of his mind, movement. It wasn't the waiter. It wasn't a fellow guest. Just beyond the large pane of glass, barely lit by the flicker of a street lamp, stood a small girl, no taller than his elbow, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, her skin a warm coffee brown under the yellow cast of the light, her hair in tight little curls pinned into a fraying ponytail. She wore a faded blue hoodie several sizes too big and a skirt with the hem dragging like an apology. Elias blinked. She was looking straight at him, or rather, straight at his plate, where a half-eaten filet mignon and lobster tail rested on porcelain as delicate as eggshells. Her eyes weren't pleading. They weren't wild or desperate. They were still, as if hunger had long ceased to scream inside her, and now only whispered. He turned back toward his wine, trying to push down the knot forming in his chest, but when he looked again, she was walking through the entrance. The maitre d' tried to stop her, his posture stiff and voice haughty, but before he could finish a sentence, she had slipped past. She approached his table without hesitation, like someone who had done this before or someone who no longer feared rejection. Her voice, when it came, was barely audible beneath the crystal clinks and murmured affluence. "Mister," she said, "can I have the rest of your food?" Elias stared, her eyes locked with his, large and brown, and old in a way no child's eyes should be. His mouth opened, but no sound came. For a moment, everything around him dulled, the music, the voices, even the taste of the wine. He felt as though he was staring across a chasm he hadn't noticed he'd created, between himself and the world outside his skyscrapers and gated communities. His first instinct was to wave for security, to restore the order of his evening. But something, perhaps her stillness, perhaps something deeper, older, rooted his hand to the table. "Take it," he said finally, the words stiff and distant. She didn't smile. She didn't devour it either. With precise movements, she reached out with a trembling hand and carefully gathered the food into a wrinkled plastic bag, the kind you get at corner stores. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out. He watched her go. He should have felt relief. He should have told himself he'd done enough, that it was just one girl in a world of many, and he had his own burdens to carry. But the way she walked, hurried, silent, vanishing back into the folds of the city, unsettled him. Why hadn't she eaten? Why the urgency? And where was she going at this hour, all alone with a bag of leftovers clutched to her chest? He sat still for several long moments, then abruptly stood up. Chairs scraped, eyes turned. He ignored them, threw several large bills onto the table, and walked out into the Atlanta night, the chill wrapping around his shoulders like guilt. The city beyond the restaurant was a different world. The polished sidewalks gave way to cracked cement, neon to flickering bulbs, polished chrome to rusted metal. Elias followed the direction she'd gone, unsure why his legs kept moving. He didn't know what he expected to find, perhaps a parent waiting around the corner, perhaps nothing. But the image of her hands, so small yet so deliberate, folding his meal like it was something sacred, would not leave him. As he turned down an alley behind an abandoned storefront, he heard it, a voice, soft and broken. "Annie, wake up. I brought food. Lobster, like Grandma used to talk about." He froze. The alley was dim, littered with trash and empty crates, and there, against a graffitied wall, lay a thin blanket spread over two bodies. One, the girl he had just seen. The other, even smaller, motionless. He stepped closer. The older girl, now on her knees, was gently shaking the younger, a toddler no older than 2. Her skin was pale, her lips cracked, and her chest barely moved with each breath. Elias's heart clenched. He had seen poor. He had seen struggling. But this was something else, something feral, something unforgivable. He knelt slowly beside them, his Italian slacks touching the grime without hesitation. The girl looked up at him, unstartled. No fear, no questions. Just the kind of exhaustion that belongs to someone who has been disappointed too many times to expect rescue. "She won't wake up," she whispered. I think she's too tired." Elias pulled out his phone, his fingers fumbling as he dialed. 911, he told them. "I've got 2 kids, one unconscious, maybe dehydrated, fevered. We're behind Broad and 14th. Hurry." He hung up and looked at the girl. "What's your name?" "Naomi," she said. Her voice was barely a sound. "And her?" "Annie Beth. She's my sister." He opened his mouth, but before he could speak again, Naomi reached into her hoodie pocket and pulled out a necklace, a small silver locket dulled by time. She opened it, revealing a tiny, grainy photo of a woman with kind eyes and a wide smile. Elias's breath caught in his throat. He knew that face. Dora. Miss Dora. The woman who had taken him in off the street when he was 12 and angry and alone, who had given him food and a mattress and a second chance, who had believed in him when no one else had. His vision blurred. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice cracked and low. Naomi looked up. "She was our grandma," she said. "She used to say, 'People forget, but sometimes they remember.'" The sirens in the distance wailed like a confession. And Elias Monroe, a man who had built towers of glass and steel, who had risen above his beginnings and silenced his past, now knelt on the cold pavement of a forgotten alley, with tears tracing lines down his cheeks. Because in that moment, with the weight of memory pressing down and 2 children curled into the folds of his history, he understood. This was no longer about food. It was about redemption. And he wasn't going to turn away this time. Elias stood there long after the ambulance had taken the girls, staring down the empty alley as if it still held echoes of the past he had buried beneath contracts, skyscrapers, and numbers that never hugged you back. The city moved on around him. Cars honked, neon signs buzzed back to life, and distant laughter from rooftop bars floated on the wind, but for him, time had cleaved into 2 parts, before Naomi and after. He walked back to the street in a daze, ignoring the stares of passers-by, who glanced at his soiled pants and expensive shoes now caked with alley dust. He didn't return to the sovereign table. He didn't even remember where he had parked. He simply moved like a man possessed, not by madness, but by a realization too heavy to carry and too urgent to ignore. The following morning found him at Riverside Children's Hospital, sitting stiffly in the corner of a pediatric ICU room, his tailored blazer draped awkwardly over a plastic chair. Annie Beth lay in the hospital bed, her tiny body covered in wires and medical tape, her breaths shallow but more consistent now. Naomi sat beside her, arms wrapped around her own knees, eyes half closed in a state of exhaustion that seemed far too practiced for a child her age. Elias said nothing at first. He didn't know how. What words could possibly explain where he'd been all these years, while the legacy of the only woman who ever saved him had withered in silence, raising children in poverty and then passing away with no one to remember her but two granddaughters with nowhere to go. Eventually, a nurse entered quietly, her voice low and sympathetic. "Are you family?" Elias opened his mouth, then paused. The truth was complicated, but the feeling wasn't. "Yes," he said. "Yes, I am." The nurse nodded and offered a weak smile, then left them alone again. Naomi finally spoke. She didn't want to go with the state, she said, her voice like a paper cut, soft but stinging. "Grandma said if anything happened, we should stay together, that someone would come." Elias swallowed the guilt rising in his throat. He remembered Dora's words, how she used to look at the stars from the porch and tell him, "Even the forgotten ones deserve a second chance." He had forgotten her. Worse, he had ignored her letters, let the phone calls go unanswered, told himself he had moved on. Now her blood was in front of him, trying to keep a dying baby sister alive with a crumpled plastic bag and borrowed hope. "I didn't come sooner," he said, staring at Annie Beth. "But I'm here now." Naomi looked at him. Her eyes didn't soften. Not yet. She had seen too much, trusted too little, and the world had taught her that promises were just another kind of lie. "Are you staying?" she asked, not with curiosity, but challenge. Elias nodded. "Yes, as long as you need." Silence followed, filled only by the beep of monitors and the ticking of a cheap wall clock. Over the next few hours, he signed papers, pulled strings, and paid for private specialists with the kind of money that used to feel like power, but now only felt like penance. He called his board and told them he was taking a leave of absence. Let the skyline wait. The world didn't need another tower right now. It needed two little girls to believe someone would actually come through. That evening, Elias sat in the hospital chapel. The stained glass windows glowed with fading daylight, casting fractured colors across the wooden pews. He didn't pray, not in the way religious men do, but he closed his eyes and whispered a name. "Dora," he said softly. "I'm sorry. I should have come back. I should have looked for you. I should have remembered." His voice cracked. "But I won't forget them. Not now. Not again." When he returned to the ICU room, Naomi was asleep, her hand still resting on Annie's arm. The nurse greeted him with a quiet update. Annie's fever was down. She was stable. She might even wake up by morning. Elias exhaled for what felt like the first time all day. He looked at the two girls, one fighting to survive, the other fighting to protect, and knew the road ahead would not be simple, but it would be worth it. For them. For Dora. For the broken part of himself that might still be saved. He sat beside them, pulled his coat around his shoulders, and stayed the night, not as a millionaire or a tycoon, but as a man trying, perhaps for the first time in years, to be human. The morning light crept in slowly, slicing through the blinds of the hospital room like soft ribbons of gold brushing against Naomi's face, casting warm halos on the sleeping child's tangled curls. Elias hadn't moved. His back ached from the rigid chair, his neck stiff from sleep's awkward angles. But he didn't care. He had spent the entire night watching over them, listening to the steady beep of the heart monitor, as if it were a lifeline, not only for Annie Beth, but for himself. At around 7:18 a.m., the silence cracked, not from monitors or footsteps, but from a fragile sound Elias hadn't realized he was holding his breath for, a tiny cough. Naomi stirred first, instinctively reaching out as Annie Beth shifted, her dry lips parting. "Naomi?" the toddler croaked. Elias stood quickly, eyes wide, emotions flooding him with a force that nearly made him dizzy. Naomi sat up fully now, eyes wide with shock, then joy, then fierce protectiveness. "I'm here, Annie. I'm here," she whispered, holding her sister's hand and blinking back tears. Annie's eyes fluttered open, still groggy, but aware, clinging to her sister's presence like a drowning child to driftwood. The nurse arrived moments later, summoned by the alert of movement. She smiled softly, professionally, and checked the vitals with practiced care. "She's improving," the nurse confirmed, glancing at Elias with mild surprise. Surprised that he was still there, still present, still wearing the same wrinkled shirt and shadowed face. But the truth was, Elias had never been more present in his life. That afternoon, the social worker arrived, a kind-faced woman named Ms. Harper, who carried a clipboard with a quiet authority that made Elias's stomach twist. She asked questions in that polite, clinical tone reserved for children in distress, but Naomi answered with a calmness that stunned everyone in the room. "Yes, we lived in the car before Grandma died," she said, her voice even. "Then we stayed behind the gas station. I always made sure Annie had crackers or something. I kept the pictures. I still remember how Grandma said to never get separated." Ms. Harper scribbled notes, her brows furrowing. "And you two were alone for how long?" Naomi paused. "I think 12 days. Elias's heart shattered anew. 12 days. A 6-year-old had kept her baby sister alive for nearly 2 weeks on the streets of Atlanta, while he had been closing billion-dollar deals and sipping imported wine. Ms. Harper turned to Elias then, narrowing her eyes slightly. "And your relation to the girls?" He didn't hesitate. "They're the granddaughters of the woman who saved my life once. That makes them mine now." The social worker didn't smile. She didn't object either. "We'll begin the temporary guardianship paperwork. But it won't be simple." Elias nodded. He didn't need it to be simple. He just needed it to be right. Later that evening, he walked through the quiet corridors of the children's wing, his mind spinning with memories. He remembered the exact moment Dora had taken him in, how she'd made room for him on the old couch with the floral covers, handed him a peanut butter sandwich without asking any questions, and said, "Every soul deserves a roof and a reason." He had turned his back on that world, told himself it was behind him, irrelevant. But now, standing in this sterile hallway, every bit of it returned like thunder. When he returned to the room, Naomi was drawing something with a crayon on the hospital notepad. Elias sat beside her and asked, "What are you drawing?" She glanced up, then held up the paper. It was crude but unmistakable. A house. 2 stick figures stood in front, one big, one small. A tiny heart floated between them. "Is that me and Annie?" he asked. Naomi shook her head. "That's me and you," she said plainly. Elias felt something snap inside, something rigid and guarded that had stood like steel walls for decades. He placed his hand gently on her shoulder, and for the first time, she didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned into it just slightly, but enough. Enough to matter. That night, Elias walked to the hospital chapel again, this time with Naomi by his side. She held Annie's locket in her hand like a talisman, and he found himself wishing it were magic, that it could undo the suffering, the hunger, the nights spent under flickering street lamps with no one watching. But he knew better. The world didn't offer magic. It offered people. And sometimes, if you were lucky, it offered second chances. He looked down at the girl beside him, the one who had reawakened a conscience buried under contracts and success, and whispered, more to himself than her, "We're going to build something real, you and I. No glass towers. A home." Naomi said nothing, but her small fingers curled around his, tight and certain. And in that silent chapel, under the glow of broken saints and dusty sunlight, Elias Monroe knew he had just found something more permanent than empire, purpose. The next morning began not with sunlight, but with the soft, uncertain laughter of 2 little girls, one still wrapped in hospital blankets, the other sitting cross-legged beside her on the bed, with a half-eaten banana and a juice box like it was a royal feast. Elias stood silently in the doorway, watching them, his arms crossed not in tension, but in quiet awe. Naomi had insisted on feeding Annie herself, every spoonful delivered with patience, every sip of juice offered with both encouragement and fierce protectiveness. She wasn't just a sister. She was a guardian forged by necessity, shaped by survival. And Elias, a man who had built a fortune creating luxury from concrete, found himself moved by something more powerful than profit, the dignity of a child who had never been given permission to be one. He stepped inside slowly, offering a gentle smile. Naomi looked up, studied him for a second, then nodded, a silent acknowledgement of his presence that, in her language, was the beginning of trust. Annie, too young to know boundaries, reached out with sticky fingers and murmured, "Hi." Elias knelt beside the bed. "Hi, sweetheart," he whispered, his throat tight. "You gave us quite a scare." Annie giggled and pointed at the Band-Aid on his knuckle. "Boo-boo," she declared. Elias laughed softly, the sound raw from underuse. "Yeah," he said, "something like that." That afternoon, he signed the first set of legal documents for emergency foster care. Ms. Harper, the social worker, informed him that more formal proceedings would follow. A background check, home assessments, court hearings. But Elias didn't flinch. He had conquered city councils and hostile real estate boards. This time, he would face the system not with leverage, but with open hands. "You'll need to prepare your home," Harper said. "It has to be child-safe. And you'll need a child psychologist, possibly trauma therapy. These girls have seen things no child should see." Elias nodded. "Whatever they need," he said simply. "Get the best." By the end of the week, Naomi and Annie were discharged. They had no suitcases, no clothes, but the ones the hospital had donated, and a plastic bag with 2 coloring books, a broken doll, and the now sacred locket. Elias escorted them to the black SUV waiting outside. The driver opened the door, but Naomi hesitated at the threshold. She looked at the vehicle like it was a spaceship. Annie clutched her sister's hand tightly. "Is it okay?" Naomi asked, her voice so soft it almost vanished. Elias knelt beside her. "It's more than okay," he said. "It's yours now." She studied his eyes, looking not for answers but for signs of betrayal, disappointment, weakness. When she found none, she nodded, helped Annie inside, and climbed in after her. As the car pulled out into traffic, Elias watched the city blur by through tinted glass. Naomi stared silently at the passing world, but Annie was full of questions. "Why are the lights blinking? Where are we going? Can we have noodles tonight?" Elias answered every question with a patient smile and a calm voice, unfamiliar yet sincere. When they arrived at his Buckhead estate, a vast stretch of modern architecture with high ceilings, Art Deco furnishings, and gardens so perfectly maintained they looked like museum pieces, Naomi froze again. She stood at the edge of the gravel driveway, as if the mansion might collapse if she stepped too close. "This isn't for us," she said quietly. "This is for people on TV." Elias knelt beside her again. "It is now," he replied, "and it's going to feel weird at first. But you belong here." She didn't respond, but when Annie squealed in delight at the marble staircase inside, Naomi's shoulders relaxed just a little. That evening, Elias gave them a tour, not the way a host would, but the way a father might. "This is the kitchen. You can eat whenever you want, whatever you want. This room is for reading. You can put books here, toys, anything you like. This," he said, opening a door, "is your room, both of you, but if you want separate ones later, we'll make it happen." Naomi stepped in slowly, trailing her fingers across the duvet like she didn't quite believe it was real. Annie flopped onto the bed and bounced, giggling wildly. "It's like a trampoline!" she yelled. That night, Elias sat outside their door for over an hour after tucking them in, listening for any sounds of fear, any sign of restlessness. But there were none. Just steady breathing and the occasional sleepy murmur from Annie. For the first time, in perhaps ever, they slept in peace. Downstairs, in his vast living room that echoed with emptiness, Elias sank into a leather armchair and stared at the flickering fireplace. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel noble. He just felt connected and terrified. Because this wasn't a deal he could buy his way out of. This was something real, something fragile, something sacred, and he was terrified of failing again. But when Naomi's footsteps padded down the stairs unexpectedly and she poked her head around the corner with a single word, "Water," he stood immediately and guided her to the kitchen. As he handed her the glass, she looked at him for a moment, then asked, "Why are you doing this?" He answered honestly without rehearsed charm or polished ego. "Because I forgot where I came from, and you reminded me." She took a sip, nodded once, and whispered, "Okay," then turned and walked back upstairs, leaving Elias alone in the dark with the realization that this small moment of trust, was more valuable than every square foot he had ever sold. The days that followed blurred into a gentle rhythm, unlike anything Elias Monroe had known before. It wasn't the structured chaos of boardrooms or the adrenaline-fueled rush of multi-million-dollar closings. It was quieter, messier, infinitely more human. Mornings began, not with alarm clocks or espresso shots, but with the sound of little feet padding across the polished floors, followed by sleepy voices calling for cereal and cartoons. Annie Beth, still regaining strength, became a constant presence in his arms, wrapped around his leg while he cooked, nestled into his chest while they read picture books on the couch, her tiny fingers always reaching for his whenever he was near. Naomi, on the other hand, remained cautious. She followed schedules rigidly, folded her clothes with almost military precision, and never asked for anything twice. She observed everything, cataloged every gesture, every promise, every flaw. Trust, Elias realized, wasn't something she could be gifted. It had to be earned, one consistent day at a time. He hired a child therapist who visited 3 times a week, a quiet woman named Dr. Lena Choi, who quickly recognized the layers of trauma woven through Naomi's small frame and carefully began unspooling them, thread by thread. One afternoon, while Elias and Naomi sat on the back patio watching Annie chase butterflies across the garden, Naomi turned to him suddenly. "Did Grandma Dora ever make you pancakes?" The question hit him like a stone to the chest, not because of the words, but because of the way she asked it, not as a test, not out of suspicion, but out of memory, a shared one. Elias smiled. "She used to make banana pancakes on Sunday mornings," he said, eyes misting. "But she always burned the edges because she talked too much." Naomi giggled softly, the sound almost foreign in her own mouth. "She told us that. She said she could never get them just right, but they were perfect anyway." Elias looked at her, saw the tears glistening at the corners of her eyes, and didn't speak. He just sat beside her, shoulder to shoulder, offering silence as comfort. That night, he cooked banana pancakes. They were uneven, lumpy, some nearly charred, and yet, when Naomi took her first bite, her face broke into something radiant. Annie clapped. "Best pancakes ever," she declared, syrup smearing her cheeks like war paint. Later that week, a letter arrived, an official document from the Department of Family and Children's Services, a scheduled home assessment, a requirement, a test. Elias read it twice, folded it carefully, and called his lawyer. "Get me everything I need," he said. "I want this to go right." And so began the transformation, not just of the house, but of Elias himself. He replaced the glass table in the living room with a wooden one, rounded at the edges, locked up the liquor cabinet, installed stair gates, converted his home office into a study room with books, maps, and colored pencils. Every decision, every change, was driven not by aesthetics but by love, a kind of love he hadn't known he was capable of until now. Naomi watched all of it with quiet interest. "You don't have to do all this," she said one evening as he installed a nightlight in the hallway. "Maybe not," he replied, "but I want to." She didn't say anything more, but that night, for the first time, she fell asleep without the locket clenched in her fist. The home visit came on a rainy Thursday. Naomi wore the new dress Elias had bought her, though she insisted on keeping her sneakers. Annie, bursting with excitement, dragged the social worker through every room like a tour guide, even pointing out the spice rack in the kitchen and the shampoo in the guest bathroom. Ms. Harper, clipboard in hand, examined everything with a discerning eye. She asked Elias dozens of questions about his criminal record, his finances, his emotional stability. He answered them all with measured honesty, never defensive, never rehearsed. When the visit ended, Ms. Harper stood at the door, her expression unreadable. "You've done a lot," she said quietly. "But these things, they're not guarantees." "I know," Elias replied. "They're just promises." Naomi stood behind him, holding Annie's hand. She didn't smile, but she didn't frown either. She just watched, measured, calculated. And then, as Ms. Harper stepped into the rain and the door closed behind her, Naomi turned to Elias and said, "You didn't lie to her, not once." He knelt down to her level. "I won't lie to you either." And for the first time, she stepped forward, slowly, cautiously, and wrapped her arms around him. It was not the hug of a child to a father, not yet, but it was the hug of a child who had stopped bracing for abandonment. Elias held her gently, his eyes closing as her small hands clung to his shirt. Somewhere in the background, Annie's laughter echoed like bells, and in that moment, surrounded by warmth and raindrops and something dangerously close to healing, Elias Monroe realized that what he was building here was not a temporary rescue. It was a family, one built not on blood, but on choice, not on history, but on hope. Autumn arrived with a quiet grace, brushing the edges of the estate's gardens with gold and amber. painting the trees outside Naomi and Annie's windows with colors that looked almost unreal against the gray sky. Elias found himself slowing down in a way that startled him, not out of fatigue, but out of reverence. Mornings were no longer marked by back-to-back meetings, but by the sound of giggles echoing down the hallway, the clatter of cereal bowls, and Naomi's voice correcting Annie's grammar like a little professor. Elias took to making breakfast himself now, often burning the toast or using too much cinnamon, but neither girl complained. In fact, Annie had taken to calling him Mr. Elias the Chef, a title he wore with amused pride. But beneath the surface of these peaceful rituals, a quiet unease began to stir. It started with a phone call from the rehab facility. A counselor named Teresa left a message on Elias's private line, her voice calm but carrying weight. Isaiah Collins is requesting to speak with his daughters, she said. He's been sober for 73 days, making progress, asking for a chance. Elias sat alone in his office for a long while after that, the fire in the hearth burning low as he stared into its flickering heart, trying to quiet the storm rising in his chest. Isaiah. The name alone held a history Elias hadn't lived but could feel, a history of absence, addiction, broken promises, and the two little girls asleep upstairs who carried every scar of it. And yet, as he stared at the message transcribed in his notebook, he knew this wasn't a decision he could make alone. That night, as he tucked Naomi into bed, she no longer clutched the locket every night, but she still kept it close. He sat at the edge of her mattress and said gently, "Naomi, your father, he wants to see you. He says he's getting better. He wants to talk." Her body went still. Her eyes didn't widen, didn't blink, but her fingers curled slightly into the blanket, subtle as a shiver. "Do you think he's changed?" she asked, and the question wasn't rhetorical. It was hopeful, cautious, terrifying. Elias didn't answer right away. He reached for her hand instead, letting her decide if she wanted to be held. When she didn't pull away, he said, "I think he's trying, but only you can decide if you're ready to hear from him." She was silent for a long time, then whispered, "I'll think about it." The following week, Naomi gave her answer. She wanted to go, not alone, not unsupervised, but she wanted to go. Elias made the arrangements carefully, bringing both girls to the rehab center with a therapist present. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sobbing reunion, no sweeping apologies. Isaiah Collins was thinner than Elias remembered from the hospital records, his face lean, his eyes sharper, clearer. He knelt before his daughters, hands shaking, voice raw. "I know I failed," he said. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just want you to know. I'm trying to be better, not for me, for you." Annie, too young to understand the gravity, reached out and touched his knee, curious. But Naomi stayed back, watched, studied. After a long moment, she asked quietly, "Why now?" Isaiah exhaled, trembling. "Because losing you was the first thing that ever hurt more than the drugs." Silence. And then Naomi stepped forward, not into his arms, but close enough to let him see her eyes, strong and clear. "I don't hate you," she said, "but I don't trust you yet." Her words were not cruel. They were a boundary. And boundaries were a beginning. On the way home, the car ride was quiet. Elias didn't press them with questions. Annie eventually fell asleep with her head on Naomi's shoulder. Naomi stared out the window, then whispered, "He looks scared." Elias nodded. "Maybe he is." "Good," she said. "He should be." But there was no anger in her voice, just truth. That night, Naomi drew again, filling a page with rough sketches of stick figures, trees, and what looked like a house with a wide porch. She showed it to Elias and said, "That's our house, the new one, with pancakes." He smiled, felt his chest tighten. "Do you want me to help you build it?" She paused, then nodded. "Yes, but this time, no glass towers, just something warm." And as Elias tucked her in, brushed a loose curl from her forehead, and turned off the light, he realized she wasn't just healing. She was beginning to imagine a future, and in that future, somehow, impossibly, he had a place. The weeks that followed unfolded like a slow bloom, delicate, uneven, but undeniably alive. The rhythm of the house had changed again, not in chaos, but in depth. Naomi had begun to hum when she cleaned her room, short little melodies she didn't realize escaped her. Annie started asking questions about everything. why the moon followed the car, how pancakes were made, what clouds were made of, and whether Grandma Dora would like the drawing she taped above her bed. Elias answered each question with a quiet, grounded joy he never imagined possible at his age, his life now orbiting the simple yet staggering fact that these two children, traumatized, intelligent, resilient, were beginning to feel safe. But safety was not permanence, and one night that truth returned like a sharp wind through a closed window. Elias received another call from the Department of Family and Children's Services. The custody hearing had been scheduled. It would determine whether he would retain legal guardianship or if the state would begin transitioning the girls back to their father, Isaiah. The thought made Elias's hand tremble as he held the phone. He had known this moment would come, but knowledge did nothing to prepare the soul. That night, as he tucked Annie into bed, her arms wrapping around the stuffed elephant he'd let her pick out from the toy store weeks ago, he asked quietly, "Sweetheart, do you like living here?" Annie looked up with wide eyes and nodded so fiercely her curls bounced. "Uh-huh. Can we stay here forever?" Her voice was so light, so trusting, that Elias had to turn his head away for a moment, blinking fast. He kissed her forehead. "I'll do everything I can." When he stepped into Naomi's room, she was already sitting up, legs folded beneath her, the locket open in her hands. She was holding a picture of Grandma Dora, her thumb gently brushing the edges of the faded photograph. "They called," Elias said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "The hearing is in 2 weeks." Naomi didn't look up. "Will they take us away?" Her voice was a whisper, fragile in its uncertainty. Elias didn't offer false comfort. He reached out and rested his hand over hers. "I don't know, but I'll fight for you, both of you, I promise." She turned her gaze to him then, eyes like embers, burned but still glowing. "Even if it means going against our dad?" Even then. Silence settled over the room, thick and heavy. And then she said, "I want to stay with you, but I don't want to hate him. I just don't know how to love him yet." Elias nodded. "That's okay. Love isn't a switch, it's a seed. It takes time and choice." In the days leading to the hearing, Elias worked harder than he had in years, not in boardrooms or negotiations, but in preparation for something far more personal. He compiled every medical record, every report from Naomi's therapist, every school progress note, every photo of birthday mornings, pancake dinners, garden afternoons. He wrote a letter to the judge himself, not as a businessman, but as a man trying to repair a thread of humanity passed down to him from a woman who once saved his life. The day of the hearing arrived beneath a slate-colored sky. Elias wore a dark suit, but not his finest. Naomi chose her own outfit, a modest dress with her sneakers, refusing to give up comfort for courtrooms. Annie, too young to understand the stakes, clutched her elephant and sat in Elias's lap in the waiting room, humming softly. When their names were called, Naomi gripped his hand tightly. The courtroom was colder than he expected. Wooden pews, buzzing fluorescent lights, a judge with tired eyes and a patient tone. Isaiah sat at the far end of the room, flanked by his caseworker and counselor, his hands clasped, his posture respectful but tense. He didn't look at Elias, but he looked at Naomi, and when he did, his eyes filled with water. Naomi looked back, held his gaze, but didn't move. The proceedings began. Testimonies, evaluations, questions asked and answered. When it was Elias's turn, he stood before the bench and spoke not like a mogul, but like a man stripped of image. "These girls," he said, "they've taught me more about resilience than anyone I've ever known. I didn't come looking for them. I didn't earn them. But now I would give everything I have to make sure they never feel alone again." When the judge turned to Naomi, her voice was quiet but steady. "I love my dad," she said, "but I'm not ready. And Mr. Elias, he never lied to me, not once." The room fell into a reverent hush. The judge took a breath, looked down, and said he needed time to review the case. The decision would be mailed within the week. That night, the house was silent. No one laughed, no one sang. But Elias sat with Naomi on the back porch, the autumn wind brushing through the tall oaks as she leaned against his side without a word, and in that silence, he understood. Love wasn't in what they said, but in who stayed when the outcome was uncertain. The letter arrived 5 days later, wrapped in a government-marked envelope that felt heavier than its weight suggested. Elias didn't open it immediately. It sat untouched on the kitchen counter as he made breakfast. Burned toast, scrambled eggs that were more scrambled than eggs, and a glass of orange juice for each girl. Naomi watched him with quiet intensity, her eyes flickering toward the envelope but never asking, while Annie swung her legs from her stool and recited the alphabet to her stuffed elephant. The moment dragged like wet cotton until Naomi finally said, "You don't have to read it now, but if it's bad, don't lie." Elias looked up, startled not by the words, but by the trust folded inside them. He reached for the envelope, his fingers slow, deliberate, like unwrapping a memory. He opened it with a knife, unfolded the crisp paper, and read. His breath caught. He read it again, then once more, slower, letting the inked words settle into his skin like a second heartbeat. The judge had granted him permanent legal guardianship of both Naomi and Annie Beth. The paper even had a stamped phrase, "In the best interest of the children," and for a moment, Elias felt everything stop. He wasn't a stand-in anymore. He wasn't temporary. He was theirs, officially, legally, permanently. Naomi's voice broke through the stillness. "So?" she asked, her back straight but her thumb nervously twisting the hem of her shirt. Elias looked up, his eyes glassy. "You're home," he whispered. "This is your home now. Always." Naomi didn't move. For a full 5 seconds, she didn't breathe. Then she let out a soft exhale, and it sounded like she'd been holding it in for months. "Okay," she said, and in her language, that word meant everything. Annie clapped without knowing why, laughing as if the world had just turned upright again. That evening, Elias took them out to celebrate, not to a fancy restaurant or a loud, crowded place, but to a small local diner with red vinyl booths and a jukebox in the corner. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with pink lipstick and a kind smile, brought over a milkshake with 2 straws just for fun. Naomi and Annie shared it without bickering, laughing with whipped cream on their noses, and Elias watched them with a reverence usually reserved for saints or symphonies. "This is better than the golden plate," Naomi declared between bites of her burger. Elias laughed. "Way better," he said. On the drive home, the girls fell asleep in the back seat, their heads resting against each other, the streetlights casting gold across their faces. Elias didn't play music. He drove in silence, letting the hum of the tires and the slow pulse of the moment fill the space. When he carried them to bed, Annie mumbled something about stars and pancakes. Naomi stirred as he tucked her in and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up." He kissed her forehead. "Thank you for letting me try." That weekend, Elias did something he hadn't done in decades. He pulled out an old photo album from the attic, dusted it off, and sat with Naomi at the dining table as they flipped through images of a much younger him, a small, crowded apartment, and a smiling black woman with a halo of gray curls, Dora. Naomi traced her finger over the photo and whispered, "She looks like us." Elias nodded. "She saved my life, just like I'm trying to save yours." Naomi frowned softly. "You didn't save us. You just showed up." And that, Elias realized, was the difference. He didn't swoop in like a hero. He stayed like a father. And now, for the first time in his life, his mansion no longer echoed with loneliness. His silence no longer suffocated him. It was filled with footsteps, drawings on the fridge, bedtime songs, spilled juice, laughter, and most of all, a future. Not one written in stock portfolios or skyline projections, but one built on pancakes, shared milkshakes, and the quiet, radical promise that he would never leave again. Life after the letter didn't become perfect. It became real, and that was better. Mornings brought the same burnt toast and spilled juice, but now they also came with Naomi's voice reminding Annie not to forget her backpack, and Elias standing in the doorway, watching them with the kind of tired joy that only comes from knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be. There were tantrums over bath time, arguments about bedtime stories, tears over forgotten homework, and laughter that echoed through the halls like wind chimes in spring. Elias learned how to braid hair, poorly at first, then with growing confidence. He attended school assemblies, sat through parent-teacher conferences with a nervousness he hadn't felt since pitching his first development deal, and spent rainy afternoons lying on the floor, coloring beside Naomi, while Annie fell asleep in a nest of pillows. Naomi continued therapy with Dr. Choi, slowly unwinding her past, unlearning the guilt of being a child forced to parent her sister, relearning what it meant to be taken care of. One evening, after a long talk with Dr. Choi, Naomi surprised Elias by asking if they could all visit Grandma Dora's old neighborhood. Elias hesitated only a second before agreeing. That weekend, they drove south through Atlanta, past the towering luxury buildings Elias once viewed as trophies, into the heartbeat of a city he had abandoned years ago. The houses there were smaller, the sidewalks cracked, but the trees were tall and proud, and the air smelled like fried okra and memory. They parked in front of a crumbling duplex with faded blue shutters and a porch swing that creaked in the breeze. Naomi held Annie's hand tightly. "She used to sit here," Elias said quietly, pointing to the swing. "Told stories about stars and sandwiches and second chances." Naomi said nothing, just looked around with eyes older than her years. Annie wandered into the yard, chasing butterflies like ghosts she couldn't name. Then Naomi spoke. "Do you think she knew we'd end up with you?" Elias exhaled slowly. "I think she hoped somebody would remember. I think she prayed the right person would." Naomi reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the locket. I want to put it here," she said, "so she knows we found her." She knelt and buried it gently beneath the rose bush that had somehow survived decades of neglect. When she stood, there were tears in her eyes, but she wasn't crying, she was blooming. On the drive home, Naomi rested her head on Elias's shoulder in the back seat, while Annie snored softly in her lap. The city lights rolled past the window like stars falling in reverse. Elias held the steering wheel with one hand and placed the other protectively over Naomi's, his heart quiet, steady, and full. That night, back at the house, Naomi placed a photo of Grandma Dora on the mantel between two hand-drawn portraits, one of Elias, drawn by Annie with pink cheeks and too many fingers, and one of their new family house, signed in crayon with 3 stick figures and a big red heart in the sky. Elias looked at it for a long time after the girls had gone to bed, standing barefoot in the darkened living room. He thought about towers and titles and the ruthless gods of success that had ruled his youth. None of it compared to this. None of it ever would, because in the quiet corners of that home, between the soft exhale of 2 sleeping girls and the whisper of memory in a silver-framed photo, Elias Monroe had found the one thing he never thought money could buy: a second chance at love that asked nothing in return but for him to stay. Autumn surrendered slowly to winter, and with it came small rituals that stitched the fabric of their new family tighter with each passing day. Naomi began waking earlier than Elias, sneaking into the kitchen to make instant oatmeal for Annie, who now called her Big Sis Mommy when she wasn't paying attention. Elias would feign sleep on purpose just to hear the way Naomi whispered instructions and encouragement in the quiet dawn, her voice soft with care that no one had ever taught her to give. She had built it on her own, out of survival, and now, love. Elias had made good on his promise to keep them safe, but the truth was, they were saving him in ways he couldn't speak aloud. They filled the long hallways of his mansion with purpose, turned cold marble into warmth, and gave each square foot a memory worth remembering. December brought the first snow, light and uncertain, just enough to dust the lawn and inspire Annie to believe the North Pole was on its way. Elias had never decorated the house for Christmas before. He'd always been too busy, too far away, too uninterested. But this year, he let the girls lead. They bought lights, too many, in colors too loud, and ornaments that didn't match but were chosen with such glee he let them cover every window, staircase, and even the bathroom mirror. Naomi hung a hand-drawn picture of Grandma Dora above the mantel, taping a red ribbon to the top. "She should be part of this," she said simply, and Elias didn't argue. On Christmas Eve, they didn't have fancy catered meals or designer gifts. They had pancakes. Elias made them from scratch, burned the first 2, nailed the third. They watched movies, curled under blankets, Annie snoring softly with her thumb in her mouth, Naomi half asleep against Elias's side. And somewhere between the second movie and the moment the fire crackled low, Elias whispered, "Thank you." Though he wasn't sure to whom, Dora, the universe, or these 2 girls who had cracked him open like a house with all the lights turned on for the first time. In the quiet that followed, Naomi murmured, "Do you think it'll last?" It was a question that carried everything: fear, history, hope. Elias kissed the top of her head. "Only if we keep choosing it," he said. "Every day." The new year arrived without fanfare, just a lazy morning of mismatched pajamas and leftover waffles. Naomi had begun drawing again, not just quick sketches, but stories. She wrote one about a girl and her sister who lived in a treehouse guarded by a tired dragon who had once been lonely, but now smiled all the time. She didn't say it was about them, but Elias saw it in every line. Annie asked if she could call him Dad one morning, casually, between bites of toast. Naomi froze, waiting for his reaction. But Elias only smiled, leaned over and whispered, "Only if you want to." Annie grinned. "Okay, Dad." Naomi said nothing, but later that night, she left a note on his pillow in carefully written cursive. "Thank you for staying. I'm not ready to say it out loud, but I think I feel it too." Elias folded the note and kept it in his wallet, right behind a photo of Dora. There were still difficult days, when Naomi would retreat into herself, when Annie would cry at night and not remember why, when Elias would wake with the weight of wondering if he was doing enough. But now they faced those days together. They had become a family, not because they said it, but because they lived it, in every meal shared, every tantrum soothed, every bedtime story read one more time than he had energy for. The mansion no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like a home. And in the quiet hours, when the girls were asleep and the firelight danced on the walls, Elias would sometimes look at the snow falling outside and remember the night he saw a little girl in a tattered hoodie asking for leftovers, unaware she would become his whole world. Spring arrived not with fanfare, but with the gentle defrosting of a life once frozen in wealth and solitude. And as the first tulips poked their heads through the thawed soil of the garden Naomi and Elias had planted together in February, something in the rhythm of their world began to shift again, this time not from pain or fear, but from growth. Naomi was smiling more now, not the cautious, rehearsed curve of lips she had once used like armor, but the full, unguarded kind that reached her eyes and lingered even after the moment passed. Annie had learned how to ride a bike with training wheels, her laugh rising into the air like music each time she wobbled down the driveway. And Elias had learned to let go of the fear that he might lose it all again. Because for the first time in his life, he understood that family wasn't about keeping. It was about showing up day after day, through the mess, through the mundane, through the milestones no one else would see. One afternoon, as the girls painted birdhouses on the porch, Naomi looked up and said, "Do you think Grandma would be proud of us?" Elias didn't answer immediately. He looked at the purple streak across her cheek, at the way Annie had managed to get paint in her hair and still laugh about it, and he said softly, "I think she already is." Naomi nodded, as if she knew that too, and went back to painting, her strokes smoother now, more certain. A few weeks later, Dr. Choi invited Elias to sit in on one of Naomi's therapy sessions, not to speak, but just to listen. He agreed, nervous but honored. In that quiet room, painted soft shades of green and filled with the scent of lavender, he watched Naomi talk about fear, abandonment, the way she used to sleep with one eye open because she thought love came with expiration dates. She didn't cry. She spoke with the clarity of someone who had walked through fire and was no longer afraid of the smoke. And when Dr. Choi asked, "What changed?" Naomi said, "He never left." 3 simple words, 3 words that wrapped around Elias's chest like vines and rooted there. After the session, as they walked to the car, Naomi handed him a folded piece of paper. "You don't have to read it now," she said. But he did. Standing under the soft pink blooms of the dogwood tree in the clinic's parking lot, he unfolded the note and read it silently. "Dear Dad, I know I haven't called you that yet, but I want to. Not because you bought us things or gave us a big house, but because you made me believe people stay. You made me believe I'm not broken, and that Annie and I matter more than your work, your past, or your pride. So, if it's okay with you, I'd like to start calling you Dad. Even if I mess it up sometimes. Love, Naomi." Elias looked up, eyes brimming, but she was already climbing into the passenger seat, pretending not to watch him. He got in beside her and whispered, "It's more than okay." That night, the 3 of them danced in the kitchen to an old Marvin Gaye song playing on the radio, flour dusting the air as they made cookies too late and laughed too much. Naomi called him Dad once, softly, almost accidentally, and he didn't mention it. just held onto the sound like it was air. And in that moment, with music humming low and joy curling like smoke from the oven, Elias knew something with absolute certainty. This was the life Dora had always believed he could have, the one she had whispered about in those nights long ago when he was just a broken boy with no roadmap. Now, he had become the home someone else could run to, and it was the most important thing he'd ever built. Summer arrived in full bloom, and with it came the kind of peace that didn't shout, didn't demand. It just settled gently over their lives like sunlight warming the bones. The house was no longer just Elias's estate, no longer a monument to his success or a mausoleum of loneliness. It had become something sacred and lived in, with sidewalk chalk drawings on the back patio, fingerprints on the windows, and the sound of Naomi practicing piano drifting softly through the hallways. Annie had named every flower in the garden, some real, some invented, and took it upon herself to teach the butterflies manners. Elias would watch her twirl barefoot through the grass, her laughter rising like a song only children know how to sing, and he'd find himself still, deeply still, in ways he never thought a man constantly chasing the next deal could ever be. Naomi, now 8 going on 40, had grown into herself in the most beautiful way. She asked bigger questions now, not out of fear but curiosity, like, why do people forget to say sorry? Or, do we get to choose who we become? Or, is it already written? Elias never rushed to answer her anymore. Sometimes he said, "What do you think?" and watched her unpack the universe with the grace of someone who had rebuilt her world from broken parts. One afternoon, while organizing some old boxes in the garage, Naomi found a dusty briefcase filled with awards, certificates, and glossy magazine covers with Elias's face smiling confidently from beneath headlines like, "Atlanta's King of Concrete." She held one up and blinked. "You were kind of famous, huh?" Elias chuckled. "Famous for things that don't matter anymore." Naomi tilted her head. "Then why did you keep them?" He paused. "To remind me who I don't want to be again." She didn't say anything, just gently placed the magazine back and whispered, "Good. I like who you are now." That night, they had a bonfire in the backyard. Marshmallows melted too quickly. Fireflies blinked like tiny applause, and Annie fell asleep curled up against Naomi's side. Elias sat in an old rocking chair watching them, listening to the crackle of wood and the quiet rhythm of a life rebuilt from grace. He thought of Dora, thought of that night outside the sovereign table, of how close he'd come to walking away. And then Naomi looked up, her voice barely louder than the fire, and said, "Do you ever think about that first night, when I asked for your leftovers?" He nodded slowly. "Every day." She gave him a small smile. "I almost didn't ask. I thought you'd yell, or pretend I wasn't there." Elias leaned forward, his eyes soft in the firelight. "I almost didn't follow you. Thought I had more important things to do." Naomi looked down at her sleeping sister, brushed a curl from Annie's forehead, then whispered, "I'm glad we both changed our minds." He reached over, took her hand, and squeezed it gently. "So am I, sweetheart. So am I." And in that moment, beneath the stars, surrounded by the warmth of fire and family and a silence that held nothing but love, Elias Monroe understood once and for all that the empire he had spent a lifetime chasing had never been built from steel or glass or fame. It had been waiting in the eyes of a little girl with a plastic bag and a whispered question that saved them both. Sometimes life doesn't give us warning signs. It gives us choices. Elias Monroe could have looked away. He could have gone back to his wine, his millions, and his silence. But instead, he chose to follow a little girl down a dark street. And in doing so, he found the light he never knew he'd lost. Naomi and Annie didn't just get a home. They gave one in return, to a man who thought he had everything until he discovered what truly mattered. So, tell us, have you ever had a moment that changed everything? A decision that redefined who you are? We'd love to hear your story in the comments below. And if this story moved you, even just a little, leave a comment. Share it with someone who believes in second chances. Subscribe for more powerful, true-to-life stories, right here on Flow Story. Because sometimes the smallest voices lead us to the loudest truths.